The morning Marcus collected his last box from the house on Alderton Drive, he was smiling. That is the detail I return to most often. Not the way he dragged the cardboard across the hardwood floors I had refinished twice. Not the way he left the front door open in January, as if the heating bill were someone else's problem. Not even the way he looked past me when he said goodbye, the way you look past furniture. What I remember is the smile, assured, triumphant. The expression of a man who believes the math has already been done in his favor, and all that remains is the counting. He had no idea the account had been closed for 11 months. I am 33 years old. I have worked with my hands, with my mind, and, for the better part of 4 decades, with a patience that my own mother once called unnatural. She meant it as a criticism. I kept it as a compliment. Patience, I have learned, is not passivity. It is the discipline of knowing precisely when to move and choosing, deliberately to wait, because the ground beneath the other person has not yet finished shifting. Let me tell you about the house on Alderton Drive, because nothing that follows makes sense without it. I bought it in 1991 for $112,000, with a down payment assembled from 3 years of double shifts at a fabrication plant and a $4,000 personal loan from my Uncle Gerald, who pressed the check into my hand at a kitchen table and told me to never let anyone sign their name next to mine on anything I didn't fully understand. I have honored that instruction every single day of my life. The house appreciated. The neighborhood changed. The schools improved. Then the coffee shops arrived. Then the young professionals. Then the boutique renovation firms, with their reclaimed wood facades and their curated anxiety about exposed brick. By 2019, a conservative appraisal placed the property at $740,000. Marcus knew the number. He had looked it up himself. I found the browser history once, before he learned to clear it, and I watched him absorb that figure the way certain people absorb inherited money, as confirmation of something they already believed they deserved. He was my son-in-law for 6 years. My daughter Renata brought him home in the winter of 2016, and I will not pretend I did not see what he was immediately, because I did. There is a specific kind of man who is kind to a woman's face and contemptuous of her history. He complimented Renata constantly in public and questioned every decision she made in private. He was charming at dinner tables and quietly corrosive in the rooms where dinners are not served. Within 14 months of their marriage, he had convinced her that my input in her financial life was interference, that my habit of keeping detailed records was controlling, and that the informal understanding Renata and I had about the property that she would one day inherit the house outright, structured cleanly, outside of probate, was an unhealthy enmeshment that a therapist he had chosen would help her untangle. I did not argue, I observed. The therapist lasted 8 months. The suggestion that Renata consider adding Marcus to a joint deed, however, that one had more staying power. It came up at a Sunday lunch in March of 2021, casually, between the salad course and the main, the way men like Marcus introduce the things they want most, as if the idea just arrived, as if no one would notice the footprints. He said it would simplify things. He said it was about security, about building something together. He reached across the table and covered Renata's hand with his, and she looked at me with that particular expression I had watched develop over 6 years, half apology, half plea, and I understood then that the conversation had been rehearsed before it was performed. I told them I would have my attorney review the options. I said it warmly, with the smile of a woman who is grateful for the suggestion. Marcus lifted his wine glass. Renata exhaled. 3 weeks later, I sat in the office of an estate attorney named Patricia Voss, on the 14th floor of a building that smelled of mahogany and cold-pressed paper, and I said 7 words that would quietly determine the next 2 years of everyone's life. I want to restructure everything before they ask again. Patricia set down her pen. She looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses with the careful attention of someone who has spent 30 years watching families destroy themselves over square footage and sentiment, and she said, "Then we have work to do." We did have work to do, and we began it that afternoon, which is precisely why, on the morning Marcus carried his last box out of a house that had never, in any legally cognizables, belonged to him or to Renata, he was smiling at a door that had already been closed from the inside. Patricia Voss had a way of organizing catastrophe that I found deeply reassuring. Her office contained no family photographs, no inspirational framed text, no soft furnishings designed to make difficult conversations feel comfortable. What it contained were bookshelves floor to ceiling, a desk the color of old bourbon, and 2 leather chairs positioned with the precision of opposing counsel. She did not offer tea. She did not ask how I was feeling. She pulled a yellow legal pad from her top drawer and capped a pen and said, "Tell me what you own, what you owe, and what you've promised, in that order." I had never in my life felt more certain I was in the correct room. I owned the house on Alderton Drive, free and clear since 2009. I owned a secondary property in a town called Millhaven, 40 minutes north, a 3-unit rental building I had purchased in 2004 under an LLC my Uncle Gerald helped me establish before he died, a structure so quietly useful that I had spent 17 years being grateful for his foresight. I owned a brokerage account, a term life policy, and a self-directed IRA that had compounded with the slow, reliable certainty of something no one was watching closely enough to interfere with. I owed nothing of consequence. And what I had promised, that was where the conversation became surgical. There had been no written agreement between Renata and me about the house. That was the first vulnerability Patricia identified, and she circled it twice on the legal pad with the dispassion of a surgeon marking an incision site. An informal promise, she explained, is a liability wearing the costume of generosity. It gives the person you love the impression of security while leaving the actual asset exposed to any number of claims, divorce proceedings, creditor actions, a son-in-law, with a working knowledge of quitclaim deeds and the patience to wait for a moment of emotional leverage. The absence of documentation was not cruelty on my part, she acknowledged. It was simply the gap that people like Marcus are trained, by instinct or design, to find and widen. I told her about the Sunday lunch, about the hand over Renata's hand, about the word simplify. Patricia's expression did not change, but her pen moved faster. She asked how long Marcus and Renata had been married, whether there were children. There were not. And whether Renata had any independent assets of meaningful size. She did not. In the 6 years of their marriage, Renata had moved from a mid-level marketing position into a role at a firm Marcus had a collegiate connection to, which meant her professional continuity was threaded through his social architecture in ways that would take time to separate. Patricia noted this without comment, the way a navigator notes weather, not as tragedy but as condition. The restructuring she proposed was not punitive. I want to be precise about that, because the story of what I did in the months that followed is frequently misunderstood by people who hear only the outcome and assume the motive was vengeance. It was not. Vengeance is reactive. What I undertook was architectural, a deliberate, considered redesign of the legal landscape surrounding every asset I had spent 40 years assembling, motivated not by anger at Marcus, but by a clear-eyed assessment of what his presence in Renata's life made structurally necessary. The house on Alderton Drive was transferred into an irrevocable trust within 60 days of that first meeting. The trust named a charitable remainder provision as secondary beneficiary and contained a no-contest clause with language Patricia described as unusually specific, her version of a compliment. The Millhaven property remained within the LLC but had its membership interest restructured so that any transfer or inheritance claim would require a unanimous resolution process that I controlled exclusively through a mechanism that would survive my incapacity and could not be compelled by a probate court in the standard sense. The brokerage account was retitled. The life policy beneficiary was amended. Each change was documented, witnessed, notarized, and filed in the appropriate jurisdiction with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that paperwork, done correctly, is the most permanent form of architecture human beings have yet invented. Renata knew none of this. That is the part that requires explanation, and I will give it the precision it deserves. I did not hide the restructuring from my daughter out of deception. I hid it from her because she was living at that moment inside a system of influence that would have converted any information I shared into its negotiating position for Marcus before the ink was dry. I had watched him work for 6 years. I knew how he processed disclosure, not as trust extended but as intelligence gathered. Telling Renata in the spring of 2021 would have been the equivalent of mailing the restructuring documents directly to opposing counsel. So I said nothing. I attended Sunday lunches. I admired the renovation Marcus had proposed for the kitchen, a renovation, I noted carefully, for which he had never once offered to contribute financially. And I listened to him describe the house as the family property with the relaxed ownership of a man who believes possession is 9/10 of proximity. Each time he used that phrase, I felt something settle further into place inside me, the way a foundation settles. Not with collapse, but with the cold, irrevocable certainty of weight finding its final position. By October of 2021, the restructuring was complete. Patricia sent me a single-line email. All instruments recorded. File is closed. I read it at the kitchen table of the house on Alderton Drive, in the same chair where Marcus had covered my daughter's hand with his and called it security. Outside, the first frost of the season had arrived without announcement, the way most permanent things do. And somewhere in the city, in an office I had never visited, a trust document with a no-contest clause sat inside a filing system that Marcus did not know existed, waiting with the patience I had spent a lifetime perfecting. He would not discover it through me. He would discover it the way people like Marcus always discover the things they underestimated. Too late, in public, with no available move left. The marriage began to dissolve the way certain structures do, not with a single catastrophic event, but through the accumulation of small, load-bearing failures that become visible only after the collapse is already underway. By the spring of 2022, Renata was calling me on Tuesday evenings, with a frequency and duration that told me everything I needed to know, without her saying any of it. Directly, we would talk about inconsequential things, a recipe, a film she had watched, the neighbor's renovation on the east side of Alderton Drive, and underneath the conversation, running like a current beneath still water, was the thing she was not yet ready to name. I did not push. I had learned, across 63 years of watching people arrive at their own conclusions, that the most useful thing you can offer someone standing at the edge of a difficult truth is simply the absence of pressure. Marcus had begun what I can only describe as a quiet campaign of financial positioning. It was subtle enough that Renata doubted her own perception of it for months, which is of course the design. He had suggested, twice in the preceding year, that they consult a financial planner, a specific one. A man named Gorley who had been 2 years ahead of Marcus at university and whose practice was built almost entirely on referrals from Marcus's professional circle. He had raised, in what he framed as a casual conversation about the future, the question of whether Renata had ever formally established what her expected inheritance position looked like and whether it might be prudent to document that in some way. He had used the word document, the way people use words when they mean something more aggressive than the word itself suggests. Renata reported this to me without understanding its full architecture. She said it felt strange, that she couldn't explain why, that maybe she was being uncharitable. I told her instincts that feel strange but can't be fully articulated are frequently the most accurate ones. She laughed briefly and then was quiet in the way that confirmed she had already known that and needed only to hear it said plainly. What I did not tell her, what I could not yet tell her, was that the expected inheritance position Marcus wanted documented was a position I had legally eliminated 7 months prior, and that any documentation Gorley produced on the subject would be a map of a territory that no longer existed in the form Marcus believed it did. The separation was initiated by Renata in July of 2022. She called me on a Wednesday morning, not a Tuesday evening, which told me the decision had been made with a finality that transcended the usual weekly rhythm of her uncertainty. Her voice was steady in the way that voices become steady after a great deal of prior unsteadiness has been privately processed and exhausted. She said she had retained an attorney. She said she was staying with a colleague temporarily. She said she was fine in the specific tone that means, I am not fine, but I am resolute, and those two things can coexist. I told her I was proud of her. I meant it with every precise, unambiguous weight the words could carry. What followed was 14 months of legal procedure, during which Marcus's attorney, a man who clearly charged by the aggressive motion rather than the productive outcome, filed a series of discovery requests targeting my assets with an enthusiasm that confirmed Marcus had spent considerable time briefing him on the expected inheritance position and its presumed value. The requests were specific. They referenced the house on Alderton Drive by address. They referenced with slightly less precision the existence of rental income from a secondary property. They were the documentary equivalent of a man who has been casing a building for years, finally submitting his floor plan to an architect and discovering, upon review, that someone has already changed every lock, rerouted every load-bearing wall, and filed the new blueprints with an authority he has no standing to challenge. Patricia handled the responses with the same economy of expression she brought to everything. Each request was answered accurately, completely, and in a manner that disclosed exactly what the law required and not one syllable beyond it. The house on Alderton Drive was held by an irrevocable trust. The trust's terms were not subject to marital asset division under the applicable statute. The LLC held the Millhaven property, and Marcus had never been a party to the LLC, a signatory on any related instrument, or a documented contributor to any asset within it. His attorney's motions accumulated like weather and produced, with equal meteorological inevitability, nothing. I watched this process from a careful distance, through Patricia's updates and Renata's intermittent calls, and I felt something that I want to describe with accuracy, because it is frequently misrepresented in stories like this one. It was not satisfaction. Satisfaction implies that the outcome exceeded expectation, and I had expected this outcome from the moment I sat down across from Patricia Voss and said, I want to restructure everything before they ask again. What I felt was closer to the sensation of watching a very long equation resolve, the specific, quiet relief of confirmation, of a proof that holds, of a structure behaving precisely as it was designed to behave, under precisely the load it was designed to bear. But Marcus had not yet reached the moment of full comprehension. His attorney was still filing. He was still, as far as I could determine from the procedural record, operating under the assumption that the inheritance position existed in some recoverable form, that there was a trust instrument somewhere with terms that could be challenged, a deed with a vulnerability his team had not yet located, a codicil that might unravel under sufficient pressure. He was, in other words, still searching the building, still certain the original floor plan was somewhere inside it. It was not. And in 4 weeks, at a mediation session Renata's attorney had finally compelled into being, Marcus's attorney would receive a document package from Patricia's office that would end the search with the irreversible efficiency of a door being sealed from the other side. I knew the date of the mediation. I had marked it in no calendar, written it in no diary. I carried it the way you carry the knowledge of something inevitable, not with anticipation exactly, but with the settled awareness of a person who has already done every piece of work the moment requires, and now only needs to wait for the moment to arrive. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday in September, in a conference room on the 9th floor of a building downtown that specialized in the kind of neutral, carpeted, aggressively inoffensive spaces where people go to divide what they built together and pretend the process is civilized. Renata had told me the address but not the time, which meant she wanted me to was happening without wanting me to track its progress hour by hour. I respected that. I stayed home on the morning of the mediation and refinished a section of the back porch railing that had been weathering poorly since the previous winter, working with linseed oil and a soft cloth in the pale September light, occupying my hands so that my mind could remain still. Patricia had prepared what she called, in her characteristically understated way, a comprehensive disclosure package. I had reviewed it the previous Thursday in her office, sitting in the same leather chair I had occupied for every meeting over the preceding 16 months, and I had read through it with the attention of someone who understands that documents of this nature are not read for surprise but for confirmation. Each page of verification that the architecture held, that nothing had shifted, that the structure I had asked Patricia to build had been built correctly and completely, and without the kind of procedural gap that opposing counsel could insert a lever into. It had been built correctly. I turned the last page, set it on the desk, and told Patricia it was clean. She said, "It is." 2 words. The most expensive 2 words I have ever been grateful for. The package contained the trust instrument for the Alderton Drive property, recorded in full, with the irrevocable designation clearly stated on page 1 in language that required no interpretation. It contained the LLC operating agreement for the Millhaven property, with the membership interest structure and the